many different subjects, but you never know it. You never know it by looking at them or listening to them. And then there are others in this world who know a little bit about something, but to hear them tell it, you'd think they knew it all from A to Z. There are some people in this world who have a good track record when it comes to being right. And others, bless their hearts, get it wrong almost every time. Most of us fall somewhere in the middle between those two extremes. Being right. Are you ever right? Don't you like to be right? Being right about something and knowing it can be an ego trip and give us a sense of power. When I am right and you are wrong, I'm up here and you're down there. I win and you lose. So the thinking goes. What's even better is when I'm right and you are wrong, and I can back you into a corner to admit that you are wrong, and then use those four little words. What are they? I told you so. It's a way for me to have power over you. One of my favorite television programs is the 1990s sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond. Do you know the show? I will watch episode after episode of that on TV Land, and even though most of the episodes I've seen about 5 times, I still laugh. It still tickles my funny bone. It is the story of a family, the Barones. Raymond and his wife Deborah and their 3 kids live next door to Raymond's parents, Frank and Marie, and Raymond's brother, Robert. Now Marie, Ray's mother, I should say, and Deborah, his wife, have a competitive and at times contentious relationship. Marie is the quintessential meddling mother-in-law. None of you out there I know. And she feels superior to Deborah in almost every way, and in her passive-aggressive put-down manner lets Deborah know that Deborah does not measure up as a cook or a housekeeper or a mother or a wife. Marie is the type that believes herself right in every argument, with, I know what's best, but if you don't want to take my advice, that's fine. Do whatever you want, dear. Don't mind me. Well, in one episode recently I watched, Marie asked Deborah about a favorite family heirloom canister. It had been her mother's, and one day she had brought some cookies over to Raymond and Deborah's house in that canister and left it, and now she wanted it back. And Deborah said, well, I've already returned it. And Marie, with a condescending look, kept at her, could you please look around, dear? For I know in all this clutter, things can easily get misplaced. But Deborah this time decides not to back down. Convinced that she has already returned the canister and that Marie this time was wrong, she confronts Marie to the point that Marie, who never backs down or never apologizes, says, oh, Deborah, even though I love that canister, you mean much more to me than the canister. Don't worry about it. I'm sorry. I never meant to doubt you or hurt you. Well, Deborah's taken aback. Marie has never done anything like that, and they hug, and Marie goes home. And Deborah feels for one time in her life she's right, and Marie's wrong, and now she has the power. But then Allie, the 8-year-old daughter, comes walking into the kitchen, holding in her arms the canister. And the remainder of the episode is the family's attempt to get the canister back to to know it all, I'm right every time Marie, without her realizing she's been right again. And everyone else having to eat crow and hearing for years, yes, dear, but do you remember the canister? For the rest of their lives. Now, in our scripture today, from Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth, Paul is addressing a question that has been put to him in a letter that he has received from the church, asking him to tell them what is right and what is wrong. The issue before them is a question that may not seem very relevant to those of us who on a regular basis enjoy our hamburgers and grilled steaks and fried chicken and pork chops and such. And maybe not relevant particularly to those of us Christians who go to churches where most dinners come centered around something to satisfy the carnivore in us, the meat eaters. I think I shared with you before, back several years ago, Jean and I decided to become vegetarians because of our moral concern about how animals are treated. And for 4 months, 4 long months, our conscience overruled our stomachs. But then we caved. The issue brought to Paul by the Corinthians was about eating meat that had been previously used in pagan rituals. Episcopal minister Katerina Whitley writes about this situation. She said the Corinthians of the first century, the Corinthian believers of the first century, surrounded as they were by so many gods and the different cultures and worship of various people who thronged that rich city, were confused. They were confused about what Christ had asked of them and by what they had learned while living in this multicultural city. And they had written to Paul with a variety of questions, and among them was the question of their diet. Was it proper to eat the meat of animals after these animals had been sacrificed to a pagan god? This was practiced widely in the Roman world. They would offer the whole animal as a sacrifice at their pagan temples, but then the meat of the animal would be sliced and it would be sold in the marketplace. And some of the new Christians in the church at Corinth, they felt superior because they had knowledge, they were educated, and because of that, they felt perfectly free to buy and eat this meat, while others in the church at Corinth were afraid that they would fall into the sin of idol worship, and so they refrained from eating the meat and would eat only vegetables. Now, today, of course, we praise them for being vegetarian, but in those days, food was scarce, and people who were knowledgeable were more concerned with feeding their families than with the niceties of a new religion that had its roots in the old Hebrew traditions. The problem with Paul's congregation was that the educated ones were making fun of the ones who were refusing to buy and eat the meat. From the Message translation, it says the question keeps coming up regarding meat that's been offered up to an idol. Should you attend meals where such meat is served or not? And we sometimes tend to think we know all we need to know to answer these kinds of questions, but sometimes our humble hearts can help us more than our proud minds. We never really know enough until we recognize that God alone knows it all. Now, some people say quite rightly that idols have no actual existence, that there's nothing to idols, that there is no God other than our one God, that no matter how many of these so-called gods are named and worshipped, they still don't add up to anything but a tall story. They say, again, quite rightly, that there is only one God the Father, Father, that everything comes from Him, and that He wants us to live for Him. Also, they say there's only one Master, Jesus the Messiah, and that everything is for His sake, including us. And yes, that is all true. In strict logic, then, nothing has happened to the meat when it's offered up to an idol. It's just like any other meat. I know that, and you may know that, but knowing isn't everything. If it becomes everything, then some people end up as know-it-alls who treat others as know-nothings. You see, real knowledge isn't that insensitive. We need to be sensitive to the fact that we may not all be at the same level of understanding in certain subjects. Some of you have spent your entire lives, he says, eating idol meat. And you're sure that there's nothing bad in the meat. But that pride becomes something bad inside of you. An imagination and conscience shaped under those conditions isn't going to change overnight. Now Paul, who would probably have eaten the meat because he knew the meat itself would not defile him, had great compassion, though, for the members of the church who felt different. Paul was sensitive to being a stumbling block to a new Christian. He would do whatever he could do to support the weak in order not to cause one of them to be afraid or to be lost. Having learned from Jesus that who matters more than what, that people matter more than rules or ideologies, Paul zeroed in on what built the congregation and discarded what puffed up the congregation. Again, Katarina Whitley says, today probably Paul would ask church people, do you have a fine choir? Do you have a gorgeous building? Good for you. But do you welcome the stranger? Do you open your doors and your hearts to the hurting? Do you care for the poor? Do you feed the hungry? Take care of what builds up the body of Christ. You see, when who matters more than what, it means we all don't always get the satisfaction of having our ideas validated as being the right ones. Nor do we get to proclaim that those with whom we disagree are necessarily in the wrong. When who matters more than what, we sacrifice the black and white world of winners and losers, and in humility, we acknowledge that we all see life through a glass dimly, right? When who matters more than what, then we care for and we help those who we may not understand, nor whose behavior do we endorse, nor whose ways we find acceptable. But when who matters more than what, we're able to keep the channels of communication open that leads to true relationships. When who matters more than what, the healing love of God can flow, and we never know how or when or where a life may be saved, or a heart changed, or a soul redeemed. You see, we got to trust God with those results. Now, if you read our gospel reading for today, it's actually from Mark chapter 1, 21 to 28. In that story, one day Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and his ideas are being very warmly received by his audience. He's impressing the crowd with his wisdom. And the story says he's suddenly interrupted by a man who was deeply disturbed. And the man just stood up right in the middle of everything and started hollering. Now, having been in a situation sort of like that a few times myself, what do you do? What do you do? Do you just ignore the man and hope that the ushers will come and quiet him down or get him out of the room? Or do you call the police? Do you let the authorities handle the disruptor? What do you do? What do you do? Well, Jesus, he stops right in the middle of his sermon, and he addresses the man and his need. people and all those points he had wished to make, wouldn't they be lost? Would he ever be able to get back on topic? What about the dignity of the worship service? What would happen to it? I don't know. It's a hard call, but Jesus chooses to put who over what. You get that? Jesus chooses to put the man who is in need of God's healing over the propriety and protocol of the moment, over getting the worship service completed as planned. Now, there are many issues out there in the world today that have found themselves even into the life of God's church. Issues that seem to divide people. Divide people of equally good character. People with strong opinions, hard and fast opinions and ideas on all sides. And who matters in that kind of divisive world? It seems like there's been movements arisen lately around that very question. Who matters? Do black lives matter? Do blue lives matter? Do women who've been sexually assaulted matter? Do immigrants, even those who don't have their legal papers, some who came with parents when they were just a toddler, do they matter? Do immigrants who've illegally crossed over our southern border because they're so desperate to save their families from hunger and poverty that they would take that risk, do they matter? Do folks who live out in our rural areas and in our small towns, have you driven through one of our small towns lately, including ones right around here and ones like the one I grew up in Indiana? Downtowns are vacant, desolated. Do the lives of the people in those small communities who have been forgotten by this economic recovery, do their lives matter? Do people in Africa and Haiti and other places in the world where disease and hunger and war still threaten widespread loss of human life every day and so much suffering, do they matter? Do sick people who do not have insurance and need health care, do they matter? Do folks who have a mental illness or who struggle with an addiction, do they matter? You see, as Christians, we are taught to believe that our lives matter. Jesus died for us, right? He died for us because he said your life matters. So what about those who claim other faith stories? What about Muslims? Do their lives matter? What about Hindus or Buddhists or people who don't have a faith group as their own? In God's eyes, do their lives matter? Have you seen on television or read the story of the Muslim teenager Malala, and I may not be pronouncing the last name right, but Yousafzai? She tells her story in an autobiography, I Am Malala. The book describes how Malala turned her personal tragedy into a global mission. You see, Malala was 11 years old when the Taliban took over her Swat Valley in northwestern Pakistan in 2008. And the Taliban, well, they bombed everything. They bombed power stations and a ski lift and hotels and funeral processions and over 400 schools. They conducted public whippings and hangings. They beheaded over 1,400 fellow Muslims. The police in that area were so terrified of being murdered that many of the police took out newspaper advertisements to announce that they quit the force. The Pakistani army eventually rooted the Taliban out of that area, or so they said, but the troubles continued. Malala's father received death threats, which wasn't a surprise. He was an outspoken political